for joining us today. We're super excited for today's meetup. So I'm just going to start off with just a quick introduction. So in terms of today's agenda, just start off with a quick introduction on who we are as the meetup team and what we do. Then we'll dive straight into the fireside Q&A with our guest speaker for today. And then move into sort of a segment around the audience Q&A. So this will be an opportunity for everyone that's attending to ask our speaker questions, any product related questions. And then we'll close at 7 o'clock. So just a little bit about the Cape Town product meetup. So we started in 2013. So 10-year anniversary, whoop, whoop. And I think towards the end of last year, just eclipsed over 1,000 members on the meetup group. We try and host these events just once a quarter. So we'll typically have just four of these throughout the year. Just you mute there? Someone's unmuted. Cool. Yeah, so host the events quarterly. And then this is some of our past speakers that we've had on the meetup. So you'll see some kind of big local startups here, Sweep South, SnapScan. Also had a speaker from, a corporate sort of startup, and founders and heads of products. We're always looking for speakers. So if you have an interesting talk that you'd like to give, or would like to maybe do sort of an Ask Me Anything type of session, please feel free to reach out to one of the organizers. Speaking of organizers, so these events are organized by Anu and myself and Anita. Anita's not with us today. She's off to Portugal, so she couldn't make it today. So please feel free to reach out to any one of us if you'd like to speak on the meetup. And so we ran a bit of a survey last year, just to get some feedback from the community. And one of the things that we sort of got from that is the need for in-person events again. So we are looking at bringing that in, hopefully in the second quarter or the third quarter. And if you know of any venues that we could potentially use and any sort of catering sponsorship that we could get for those events, please do reach out to us as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Please just throughout the session, make sure that you are on mute. Then sort of during the Q&A, please feel free to either type your questions in the chat window, or once we're in the audience Q&A session, you can just raise your hand and then you can unmute and ask your questions. We are recording the session and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. For those of you that are quick with your fingers, please do tweet any learnings or interesting insights that you learned today. Our hashtag is CTProdMGMT. Cool. So let's not waste too much time and let's get sort of straight into why we're here today. Today our guest speaker is Ravi Mehta. So Ravi has spent his career building and scaling sort of great consumer technology products and teams. He's currently the CEO and co-founder at a startup called Outpace. He was sort of an executive in residence at Reforge, where he helped them create their product leadership program and also helped them launch their product strategy program. He's worked as the CPO at Tinder, product director at Facebook, also the head of consumer product at TripAdvisor, and he was also part of the sort of an early member of the Xbox team. So worked at a lot of sort of big technology companies. Ravi, welcome to the meetup. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Glad we could finally make this happen. I think we're all super excited to hear from you. Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of touched on, you know, you've worked at Tinder and Facebook and TripAdvisor, but I wanted to give you just an opportunity to kind of expand a little bit on your background and add some color to it. So maybe you could just expand a little bit on your background and some of the interesting experiences that you've had in your career.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I've been a lifelong product person. I started really early. So I started to learn to code when I was a kid. I fell in love with technology, and I started a game company when I was in high school and college. I thought I would go into engineering since I learned to program and I did a degree in computer engineering. And then when I interviewed, I did a bunch of interviews for engineering roles, and Microsoft accidentally put me in interviews for a product management position. And I found the conversation fascinating. There were all these interesting things that we talked about during the interview that I knew nothing about. And I was really curious about how to create better products for people. And so I ended up accepting a PM role at Microsoft, and I've been a product leader and product manager ever since. And so I kind of got into this accidentally, but it's really been a lifelong passion. There's kind of two threads to the work that I've done. One is I've almost always focused on things that are consumer focused. I'm really excited about how does technology change everyday people's lives. And I'm just as excited today as I was, when I got my career started, which is many, many years ago. And I think, there's just as interesting problems to solve. And then most of what I worked on also has a social element. My work at Microsoft was largely focused on Xbox Live, really thinking about how does the internet change gaming. I spent time thinking about how to connect travelers at TripAdvisor, more pure play social at Facebook, particularly around social products for Gen Z, definitely at Tinder, that was highly socially focused. And then I recently, about 18 months ago, started a company called Outpace. Our goal is to make professional coaching much more accessible for people, knowing that a person's professional success is really tied to their personal sense of wellness. And, as I was thinking about what I wanted to do next and what are the most important relationships in a person's life, one of the things I came back to over and over again is that for the people who've had the opportunity to experience coaching, often those are some of the most important relationships, similar to close friendships, similar to the relationship with a therapist or with other folks. And so I was excited to start something which I think is going to be an increasingly important trend to make sure that people have the allies that they need to be successful in their careers. So that's a little bit more about me. Happy to answer more questions about my careers and the choices, or my career and the choices that I made over time.
Awesome, fantastic. It's always interesting to just hear about how people get into product. Some people come from different departments, or we just all kind of accidentally just stumble into product management. But thank you very much for sharing that. You've created a couple of sort of product frameworks, and where I kind of came across Ravi was through this product strategy stack framework, which was super interesting to me and kind of what got me to reach out to you. I think it would be great to start there, and maybe you can share a little bit about kind of why and how you conceptualized this framework, and then just talk a little bit about kind of what the product strategy stack is. So we've got a little bit of an image here just to help visualize it for everyone. But yeah, maybe you can just talk through a little bit about that.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I first started thinking about like what is actually product strategy and how do you define a good product strategy a few years ago when I was at TripAdvisor. And what I noticed was that oftentimes product teams would have a hard time prioritizing. So the question would be at a very tactical level, should we do A or B? One of the examples of that was particularly challenging to work through was what should the 5 or so tabs be at the bottom of the TripAdvisor mobile application? Should it be this or that? And there's always more potential things to put within that navigation than there is like just pixel space to be able to do that. And what I realized is that a lot of these kind of small tactical prioritization decisions, if you track them back, it was actually the case that these were things where the strategy wasn't well understood. So the product team didn't have a clear strategic framework within which to make these decisions. And so it was less about how do you prioritize this particular tactical thing about what should this string say or what should this feature work like, and more about what is it that we're trying to do? What are the tenets by which we operate? And as a result, what are the things that we should do based on that framework? And so I started to think about and work with my teams on, what is actually strategy and how do we create a process for being able to define an effective strategy? And what I found during that process is that the word strategy has just sort of been stretched beyond meaning. It's one of these things that people kind of put on everything. Things are strategic or not. And sometimes when people talk about strategy, they're talking about a roadmap. Sometimes they're talking about goals. Sometimes they're talking about metrics. But ultimately, strategy is not any of those things. If we really get back to the root of what strategy is about having a deeply logical and rational plan for how to use the advantages that you as a company and as a team have to be successful in the market. And the product strategy stack is an attempt to pull apart that conflation of all of these different things that people typically conflate together in terms of strategy and create a small but clear set of related concepts that we can use to work towards a clear plan that's really effective for the product team. And so there's 5 layers to this stack. The first one is really, really qualitative. It's the mission. The mission is, what is your company trying to change about the world? So the change your company wants to bring to the world. And this is really important because every decision that you make will flow from that mission. And if it doesn't flow from that mission, then it means that the strategy and the roadmap and the goals aren't necessarily coherent towards a particular end. One of the things that I like to say is mission should be emotional. It should be aspirational. Goals should be quantitative and strategy should be logical. So that's how these different pieces fit together. Once you have a clear understanding of your mission, from there you can say, let's put together a strategic plan. So what's the plan, the rigorously logical plan that we have to bring our company's mission into being? And that's a plan that should be informed by what is your company uniquely great at? What are the dynamics of the market? What are the different pieces that you can put into place? What are the different resources that you have? And so the mission and the company strategy work together to define the company objectives. So what is the environment within which the product is operating? And then the glue between that set of company objectives and the day-to-day delivery work of the product team is ultimately the product strategy. So the product strategy is the plan for how the product will drive its part of the company strategy. And there's a couple of key things here. One is that your product strategy is really just part of the company strategy. I think today's companies are so product focused that it can be easy to sort of think about the product strategy as being the only part of company strategy. But no matter how product focused your company is, there are other elements of the company strategy that your product strategy is going to need to interoperate with. That could be marketing strategy or growth strategy, technology strategy, sales strategy, all of those different pieces. So the product strategy is the particular role that the product plays. And then once you have a really clear idea of what that plan is, now you can start to put together the deliverables that are part of the execution work that the product team needs to do. And that's the product roadmap. That's the sequence of features that implement your product strategy. And finally, at the bottom, not the top, which is a controversial thing, are the product goals. What are the outcomes of the roadmap that measure product strategy progress? And so one of the controversial things that I talk about within this framework is I think that goals are the output of strategy rather than the input to strategy. Goals are the evidence that you've made progress on your strategy, not the thing that you should create a strategy to solve for. And so I can go into that a little bit more. I know it's a controversial point, but the analogy I like to use there is, if we say we're going to take a road trip if we say we're going to take a road trip, what's really important is where are you starting from and where's your destination? So I live in LA. I might say I want to take a road trip to Las Vegas. I can't say that I will get there after I've driven 200 miles. So I can't say my goal is to drive 200 miles because I can drive 200 miles in any direction. Same with retention or revenue, right? I can increase retention in any number of ways. I can increase revenue in any number of ways. Whether or not I've reached my goal may or may not be evidence that I've actually gotten to my destination. And so really important, the reason to start with mission and company strategy is to start with the destination, and then you can create goals that are milestone markers on the way to that destination versus instead having untethered goals. Give something for the team to work towards, but in a way that may or may not be cohesive with the long-term strategy for the company and the way in which the company is going to be successful. So that was a lot. Happy to pause and take questions about that.
Awesome, cool. I think what we'll do is we'll just touch on a couple of different topics for about the next 10 minutes, and then we'll open
sounds good.
To the audience. I guess just staying on goals, a lot of people working in tech are familiar with OKRs, but you've created another sort of framework, your own sort of goal setting framework called narrative, commitments, and tasks. And I thought it would be useful, if you could just share with us what this framework is and kind of why it provides a more complete sort of goal setting system, and maybe just any tips on how one could potentially introduce or experiment with this within their own organization.
Yeah, so almost every product team that I've worked with or advised has had challenges with OKRs. And I think a lot of people here will be familiar with those. And so NCTs came about as part of me working with the team at TripAdvisor to understand why are we having such a challenge using OKRs effectively. We really wanted to get good at OKRs. And one of the things that I think is important is to understand that goal setting is both a habit and a skill. So it takes time to get good at. It's not that you just set your goals and you're naturally going to be good at it. So it's okay that it takes time. We really committed ourselves to figuring out how can we implement OKRs incredibly effectively. And then what I realized over time is that OKRs is a very general purpose goal setting framework. It's, you can use it to set personal goals. In John Doerr's book, he talks about Bono using them to set personal goals for himself. You can use it to set team goals. And because it's such a general framework, it's not opinionated about what are the things that a product team in particular needs to do to set goals that move the company strategy forward. And you can certainly retrofit OKRs to do that. But there are a couple of pieces that narrative and commitments and tasks look to solve for. And you can solve for these same things with OKRs. It's just that the words that we use with narrative and commitments and tasks is very specific about what does a product team need to accomplish from a goal standpoint. The first piece that's different from OKRs is there's three pieces, not two. In Measure What Matters, John Doerr talks about the fact that a good goal setting framework answers the why, the what, and the how. And he talks about this in his TED Talk as well. And I think any goal setting framework needs to answer those three questions. The problem is OKRs only answer 2 out of those 3 questions. And that's often where people get tripped up. In sort of best practices around OKRs. The objective is the what, and the key result is the how, and the why comes from elsewhere. The why is extrinsic to the goal setting. And that works incredibly well at companies that have been successful with OKRs, like Google and like Intel, that have separate strategy processes that can inform the OKRs. But that's not something that every company has. And so the first piece of narrative, commitments, and tasks is the narrative. And the idea here is that it is a description of what strategically, from a qualitative standpoint, from a logical standpoint, are we trying to solve for with this goal. And we use the word narrative really deliberately because it's about telling a story around what you're trying to achieve. And it shouldn't necessarily be a terse 4 or 5 words. It can be a couple of sentences. You want to provide some context of, why did you set this goal? What are you trying to achieve with this goal? What's the future going to look like with this goal? And so having 2 to 3 sentences just to set the stage for a particular goal is really important, because it connects that goal back to the strategy that you're solving for with the product, and that you're ultimately solving for the company. The second thing is to think about the really substantive part of your goal as a set of commitments that the team is going to make. In traditional OKR best practice, they say that you should strive to hit about 50 to 75% of your key results. That can work fine for personal goal setting. That doesn't work well for a team setting goals, because it means that you don't have clarity about what's going to get done at the end of a quarter. If only 50% of your goals are going to get done by the end of a quarter, you actually really have no insight into what's going to get done, which doesn't work well in terms of predictability. It doesn't work well in terms of financial planning. It doesn't work well in terms of team dependencies. And so as a result, the NCT framework shifts that and says, no, we're going to make commitments that we're 100% committed to solving. It's not the case that you need to hit every single commitment every single quarter. We're all human, but we should set commitments based on what we're committed to rather than what we aspire to. So it creates a lot more clarity around what we're going to achieve by the end of the quarter. The second thing that's really important about commitments is these are not framed as metrics or key results or in any sort of quantitative way, because sometimes the things that we want to commit to are moving a particular metric, like improving retention by 5%. But sometimes the right thing for a team to commit to is not an outcome, but actually an output. I think that's another thing that is challenging about the way that people typically use OKRs. We always think about outcomes over outputs, but ultimately we can only solve for outcomes if we know how to solve for those outcomes. And sometimes the right thing to solve for in order to get to that outcome is to work backwards. And that might be that we're committing to ship a feature, we're committing to implement a process, we're committing to do some understanding work. All of those things are as valid as achieving a metrics-based goal. And so the idea with commitments is that it gives teams the flexibility to say, here are the deliverables that we're going to commit to, regardless of whether or not they're quantitative or qualitative. And then the last piece are the tasks. And so one of the things I see that a lot of teams do with OKRs is they often start a quarter with a cold start. So they've set these really ambitious OKRs. They have these metrics that they want to hit, and they haven't, as part of that planning process, actually talked about specifically what are you going to do. And the idea there is that the team should have autonomy. The team should be able to figure out what is the path to being able to hit your goals, which I completely agree with. But that doesn't mean that you don't do any planning ahead of time, because if you don't do any planning ahead of time, you start the quarter not really understanding how to actually achieve your OKRs. And so tasks are essentially a scratch pad of the how. Here's all the things that we're going to do in order to meet our goals. And ultimately, the tasks are completely fungible. So if at the end of the quarter, you've achieved none of your tasks, but all of your commitments, it's a successful quarter. It just means that you figured out a different way to achieve your commitments. If, on the other hand, you've achieved all of your tasks, you've checked them off the list, but achieved none of your commitments, then that quarter is not successful because you've done a lot of stuff, but you haven't moved the ball forward. So collectively, these 3 pieces, the narrative, the commitments, and the tasks, solve for the why, the what, and the how, and do it in a way that's really opinionated for how to set goals in a way that's really effective for product teams that are working within a system, delivering features and outcomes and product functionality for that interacts with the rest of the product organization and the rest of the company.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you. We're just going to touch on one last topic and then open it up to the audience. So the last one is, I can tell that you're a creator at heart. So I think sort of getting your team structure right is probably one of the most important boxes that product leaders need to tick. And you've created, I think, what you've called the product organization metrics to help leaders like pick the right structure and then kind of see the trade-offs that they're making and explicit decisions when whilst building out their team structure. Can you maybe in about 5 minutes just tell us a little bit about this and what are these different structures within the matrix and some of the implications behind picking a particular structure?
Yeah, definitely. So I first started thinking about this when I was thinking about the question of, is the product manager the CEO of the product? And so there's a famous debate within the product community. Some people say, yeah, the PM is the CEO of the product. Other people say, no, absolutely not. The product manager is not the CEO of the product. And I was trying to understand from an organizational design standpoint, what's the right answer there? And how do you set up a really strong product team? And it turns out that there's not a right answer there, that ultimately there are incredibly successful companies that where the product manager has direct responsibility and accountability for business outcomes. And there's other ones where the expectation is that the product manager and product leader will act more as a facilitator. And so there's really two decisions that we need to make in order to set up our product organization. We need to determine what is our philosophy around accountability and what is our philosophy around collaboration. And so the accountability question is, are our product teams accountable for business outcomes, or are they ultimately accountable for features? And either one of these can work. So you can have a team that's focused on retention. You can also have a team that's focused on CRM, or you can have a team that's focused on messaging or onboarding. Classic example is, do you have a team that's focused on activation, or do you have a team that's focused on onboarding? You can do one or the other. In both cases, there's going to be some overlap, right? The onboarding team is going to have some metrics that they're solving for related to activation. The activation team is going to have some feature ownership in areas of the product related to onboarding. This is a really important question, though, of how do you define your team? And there's not one right answer. It really depends on what are you solving for, and all things being equal, what do you want the product team to focus on? And so do you want the product team to focus on delivering the very best feature in their area, or do you want the product team to focus on moving outside of that feature area and doing what they need to do in order to move towards business outcomes? So that's the accountability question. Then the collaboration question is, how does a product team work with the rest of the organization in order to deliver those things? And you can really have two different things there. You can have the PM as an owner, where you could think about the PM as the CEO of the product, because ultimately teams are going to hold PMs accountable for delivering on the areas that their team is responsible for, and they're going to be directly accountable, and that's going to show up on their performance review. Or you can say the PM is really a facilitator role, and ultimately the role of the PM is not to own any one metric or outcome, but to be the conductor that works incredibly well with a cross-functional team to align that team towards the things that define that team's success. And if we look at these two questions together, we get 4 different options for how you define your organization. And you can pick and choose from these based on different teams. It's often nice to have simplicity and define all of your teams in the same way. But if you need to, and if you have a big enough org, you can have different, different ways of organizing for different teams. One of the things that's a very clear approach is the outcome owner approach, where you have a team defined for an outcome like revenue or retention, and the PM owns that and is directly accountable for that. This is closest to how a lot of teams at Amazon work, where you have directly responsible individuals. On the other side, you can have outcome facilitators. And so you can say that the revenue growth team is responsible for revenue, but it's not just the PM that's responsible. It's everyone on that team, the engineering leader, the design leader, the user research, anyone that's part of that cross-functional team is ultimately responsible for that outcome. And it's really important that if that's your philosophy about how to drive the organization, that you don't hold the PM differently accountable than the rest of the team. If the team hits its goals, everyone gets rewarded, including the PM. If the team doesn't hit their goals, that reflects on everyone. And it's not the PM is held differently accountable. If they are held differently accountable, then you have more of an outcome owner type of organization. And then on the bottom of the matrix, we have feature owners. So in this case, the product manager is directly accountable for certain feature areas of the product. It could be things like messaging or onboarding or things of that sort. And then the final one is feature facilitator, which is actually a model that works incredibly well for companies that are very much focused on the craft of product and less on the business outcomes. So a lot of teams at Apple, for example, are feature facilitator teams, where the product manager has a particular area of ownership and is working in a very cross-functional, very collaborative way to make sure that that team delivers the very best functionality for the product. And so each of these different quadrants can work depending on the business, depending on the philosophy behind the organization. The really important thing here is not that one quadrant is right or not, but that the company be really clear about these decisions and not ultimately hold a PM accountable for both being collaborative as well as for being directly responsible for both owning features as well as owning business outcomes, because then that creates these kind of in-between states in terms of how the organization is designed, which ultimately puts PMs in sort of an unfair position of having to do both, but not necessarily having the authority or the remit to do both.
Awesome. Thank you. Fantastic.
Yeah, definitely.
We've got about 25 minutes left. So I do want to give some of the bright minds that we have within the audience to ask questions during the last part of the section. So I see there is one question here. So I'll start from MG. What are some of the business strategy frameworks that Ravi has worked with, and how do they work with these product strategy frameworks? Has he ever worked with scaling up as one example? Any thoughts on this particular framework for product-led organizations?
Yeah, I'm actually not familiar with scaling up. Happy to learn more about it. Some of the things that informed the strategy stack, or some of the things that I learned in strategy when I went to business school. So some of the classic stuff around Michael Porter and the 5 forces and comparative advantage and things of that sort. If there's one book you're going to read on strategy, I highly recommend a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. That's a fantastic book that talks generally about company strategy, where the author is really clear about some of these dysfunctions around strategy, around companies that are, say, our strategy is to increase revenue by 5%. But yeah, actually, that's not a strategy. That's a goal. The plan that enables you to do that is strategy. And so that's a fantastic resource, and then informs some of the thinking around the product strategy stack. And particularly for product-led organizations, I love the work that Reforge has done. I think there's a ton of really good frameworks to think about from a product-led standpoint within the Reforge material. And I highly recommend that, starting with Reforge's Growth Series program. And then there's a bunch of different related programs around retention and engagement and monetization, growth leadership. In terms of like the quality of the content, I really think like Reforge is the best right now. But I'm biased.
Awesome, cool. Thank you. Next question. I know who this is, so I'm going to kind of force them to unmute and ask the question themselves. Roger, do you want to ask your question?
Cool, happy to unmute. I'm leaving my camera off because I've just wrapped up supper for a toddler. I guess, so Ravi, I love your work. I use the frameworks quite a lot. I work at a venture builder and I run the product strategy stack with almost every startup. But the one
that's
thing
great.
that I find lands a lot better is to define the goals before the product roadmap. So you go company strategy, vision, mission, company strategy, product roadmap, and then defining sort of product goals or the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and then defining the roadmap. And that kind of allows for a lot more of the now, next, later approach, where you can run sort of multiple different experiments. I'm dealing with early stage startups, so that's more applicable. So the roadmap is less fixed, but we're trying multiple different things in order to execute a goal to deliver on the strategy, instead of product strategy, defining a roadmap, and then we measure whether that affects. What did your reflection around that be? And specifically, I suppose it might be unique to this use case, or is that more applicable widely?
Yeah, I think this is the most controversial part of the piece. And I think that there's good arguments on both sides to say to start with goals or start with roadmap. As I've had conversations with people, I think one of the things that has driven the controversy about this is how we're defining roadmap. And so I define roadmap at a pretty high level. And so there's a pretty significant difference between a backlog and a roadmap. And so there's a certain level of granularity where it's really important to make decisions about how you sequence out your strategy. And only after you've done that can you start to define goals. That doesn't mean that you have to have like the 100 items before you start to define your goals. In fact, I would say that comes after. But there is a question of, what do we do now versus what do we do later, that shouldn't necessarily be driven by your goals and should be driven by, in terms of that really rigorous, that logical strategy, what are the things that we need to do first in order to win in the market? And the goal is not going to provide the path. It's the strategy that's going to provide the path. So, let's say you could think, I don't always like wartime analogies, but if you think about like, we want to win the war, you don't say our goal is to win the war and we'll win the war after 20 battles. You need to have a really deeply logical strategy for how you're going to win the war. And then once you have that strategy of where you're going to, how you're going to approach that, then you could say we can set some goals around, are we making progress against that strategy? And so the thing that I try to avoid is that the dysfunction I see more often with teams is not under indexing on goals. It's actually over indexing on goals. It's really like being preoccupied with the goals and being and under investing in that logical thinking around how do we achieve them. And so that's one of the reasons I say that roadmap should start first. You should know what that sequence looks like, and then you should define your goals in light of that sequence. But it can go both ways, and I know that there's different opinions on that.
Yeah, I suppose it also comes down to how you define your goals, because if your goals are sort of, if the strategy is to undermine their supply lines in a war, your goals would be how many shortages they run into or how many times you can measure those things, and then your roadmap would be the ways in which you might destroy those supply lines. But I guess it all comes in semantics of goals versus roadmap and which level you're talking about, the things you're delivering or how you're measuring success.
And you hit on something really important, which is that it's an iterative loop-based process. Like the strategy is not something you do once and then you just execute on it. At the end of setting a roadmap, achieving your goals, you're going to have learned a lot, and then that could feed back into the strategy. And over time, that enables you to continue to evolve the strategy on a regular pace, so that as you learn more, as you gain greater understanding, the strategy is evolving based on that.
Great, thanks for time.
Awesome, thank you, Roger. Cool. Tim Gregory raised hand. Hey, Tim, go ahead.
Thank you. Hey, Ravi. I'm going to try and slip in 2 questions related to the product strategy stack, if I may. So one of I've used the model. I really like it. I think one of the strengths of the model that you didn't really talk about so much today is the dependency between the layers, that you're probably not going to have a good company strategy without having a mission, and likewise, you're not going to have a product roadmap without product strategy and company strategy. So I think this is a really key aspect of the model for me, is these dependencies between the layers. I've had a recent experience where I found it extremely difficult to come up with a coherent product strategy because the company strategy was all over the place.
Yeah.
So I'll give you 2 quick examples. So we launched in 4 countries across Europe, and it was my belief that internationalization was a pillar of our product strategy, and then we withdrew from all of these markets quite rapidly. And part of the product strategy was around helping customers understand the difference between financing and leasing, and then we cut the whole car rental part out of our business. We stopped doing rentals. So what advice do you have in this kind of environment where there's a lot of kind of rapid iteration or fluid movement at the company strategy level, and as a product leader, you're trying to come up with a product strategy that can last a couple of quarters, perhaps?
Yeah, this is very common. And I think one of the particular challenges for product teams is that product is often where the rubber meets the road on the company strategy. And so as a result, it's the place where any gaps in that strategy or any dynamism in that strategy starts to show up in a way that's really hard for the product team to resolve. There's kind of two ways to approach this. One is to look to the leadership team to clarify the strategy. That rarely works, in part because it's a very hard thing to do. It takes time. It may be that even after that effort, you don't necessarily get the questions answered that you need answered at the product level, meaning that like the strategy isn't executable. The other approach, which I think works well for product teams, is to use something like the strategy stack, identify the gaps that are key things that are making it hard for the team to understand, like, what is the framework that you're working within, and then based on your best understanding of what the business is trying to accomplish, make some assumptions and say upfront in your product plans, here's what we are defining the strategy as, here's some of the assumptions that we've made about what we're trying to accomplish, and here's the right product strategy roadmap and goals based on these set of strategic assumptions. And then when you present to leadership or you're reviewing with leadership, that means that the product team can move forward on complete product planning. And then when you present to leadership, you can have a conversation around, is the plan the right plan? Are the assumptions the right assumptions? And so as a result, if the leadership team says, yeah, I don't know that these assumptions are correct, it doesn't look like you're solving for the right thing from a strategy perspective, that's incredibly revealing. You can have a much deeper conversation than you would typically. Or if the team says, yeah, your assumptions look right, here's some things that we are concerned about at the product plan, then that allows you to have that conversation. So by making those assumptions, you clear the road back, and you also have the stimulus for a much more effective conversation with leadership. And the thing that's important is, like, a lot of times product teams don't feel comfortable making those assumptions, either because they're not sure that it's their role, or they might not have all the context. If your company is willing to support that, I think it's better to kind of push through that, make those assumptions, and kick off those conversations from a position of, we're talking relative to a plan versus we're talking from a blank slate.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really useful aspect of something like OKRs, is all the conversations that it prompts.
For sure.
To make sure. If I can slip another one in, just looking at the subtext on the product roadmap block, it says something about the sequence of features that implement the product strategy. Any comment on some fairly recent work on, like, Bruce McCarthy's product roadmaps relaunched work, which really focuses more on opportunity roadmaps rather than feature lists?
Yeah, I think it probably is the wrong word. I think it should be opportunities or initiatives. So it's the sequence of product initiatives that implement the product strategy. And that might be a set of features, that might be an opportunity solution tree, it might be a different way of doing roadmaps, but that's a good call out.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tim. Bobby's got a question in the chat. How can you win influence to implement these frameworks in a big corporate team where things are slow, bureaucratic, with no clear goals?
Yeah, I think the first step is to the extent that you can always use them for yourself, right? You can always use them to help your own thinking, to get to a really informed perspective on, what should the goals for my team be, or what should the strategy be, or how should we be organized. So start there. And then you could start to radiate them outwards from there, work with your own team. NCTs is a good example, right? It's often not feasible for a PM to say, hey, we're going to start using NCTs instead of OKRs. I completely understand that. In that case, you could continue to use OKRs, but you could say, why don't we take some of these ideas? Why don't we say, let's spend a little bit of extra time on the storytelling around the OKR. So let's start each OKR document with a bit of a strategic narrative. Or if all the key results are metrics oriented and you're finding that you don't know exactly how you're going to hit those metrics, why don't you say, let's add a couple of key results that are more output based, that help us get to a deeper level of understanding. And so you can use the philosophies behind something like NCTs. And there's even in the blog article that I have, there's even some ideas on how to do that. And so you start to use the ideas, even if nominally the framework is what the company has vetted and approved. And you could do that around strategy and organization as a result. And then over time, the goal is with this way of thinking, or with a more structured way of thinking, whether it's these things or other things, to set up your team for success. And as your team has success, that creates a really nice virtuous cycle where there's more confidence, there's more conviction, and that will give you more leverage to be able to make these changes more substantively within your organization.
Awesome. Thank you, Bobby. I hope that answered your question.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Moving on to Wesley's got a question in the chat. PMs have to analyze information, including customer research, economic signals, competitive activity, creating and setting strategy and roadmaps. How do PMs make sure they don't get lost in all of this information?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I have an article on my site where I talk about the 3 pillars of product decision making. And there's really 3 inputs into any product decision. The first one is analytics. So all of the things that you talked about. So your user analytics, competitive intelligence, things of that sort. That's all the quantitative input into a product decision. Then the other input into a product decision is the voice of the customer. So all the product research and talking to customers is incredibly important before making a product decision. And then the third piece that's an input into their product decision is intuition. So what is the product manager's intuition of how to synthesize the analytics and the research into a really strong product initiative for the user? And I think 2 things can help with this. The first one is to make sure that you're drawing from all of those things. I think sometimes, especially when it comes to analytics, we can look for more. If we're not getting the conviction, it could be that we go deeper and deeper and deeper into the numbers, but we're actually not getting more clarity. And the thing that will get you more clarity is to go talk to some customers, or to say, I have enough data. I now need to use my intuition to put all of this together. So that's the first thing, is to make sure that as you're making product decisions, you're drawing from all 3 of these pillars. And then the second thing that I think is worth thinking about is within product, the fact that things have gotten so much more quantitative, the fact that there's so much more data to work with. The thing that a lot of product managers look for when making product decisions is statistical significance. And it's like, let's run an experiment. We'll run an experiment, and then we can make a decision based on that. And that's scientifically accurate. The problem is that statistical significance is really hard to get to with a small amount of data. And most confidence intervals are only 90 or 95%. That means that any statistically significant decision that you make is going to be wrong 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 times, just by virtue of the math. And a more important bar to hold yourself to is not statistical significance, but really informed conviction. What is the right amount of information that we need in order to have conviction that we can move forward? And once you have that conviction, you can move forward. And just by the process of moving forward, you're going to learn more. That's going to add more information. That's going to add to your conviction and help you with the next step. So 2 things. Really draw from all of the different pillars of information that you have when making a product decision, and 2, look for informed conviction over statistical significance.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got 7 minutes left. Let's go to Chris, who's got his hand up.
Hi, Ravi. Thank you so much. I think you actually just answered my question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I come from UX design and UX research, so I'm a part of the product team. I'm not a PM or a PO. And the thing that I've been bumping into is with OKRs or any sort of metric, it's quite hard to quantify customer insight if it's not a survey or something that we can quantify. So doing some user interviews or usability test, it's usually aid in a process as opposed to a metric itself. And I've been finding quite hard to like constantly prove that it's worthwhile when the input might only impact an OKR that's months or 3 quarters away. So what I'm really quite excited about is the outcome facilitator role, or the feature facilitator role, where you have a number of experts which you're relying on, and you're not necessarily committing to a metric, but you've got a commitment that is, like you're saying, it doesn't have to be a metric that you're measuring. It could be number of people that you've spoken to, for example. And I kind of just want to find out a little bit more about the practicalities of that facilitator role. So you have a couple of people that all have their own objectives. You obviously have a business person. You have someone like me who's like, I want to speak to as many people as possible. How do you manage that on like a practical level? Who decides on the final commitments when you have a facilitator role?
So I think it's a great question. In a owner role, it's really clear. You have one person. In a facilitator role, it's important for that facilitator to understand that their role is to create consensus among all of the people that are participating. That doesn't mean creating compromise. That means, a strong opinionated decision can come from consensus if you have the right processes and the right philosophies and expectations in place. And so one of the reasons I refer to the facilitator role as a conductor role is it's kind of like a conductor in an orchestra. That person is not making a decision about what every person in the orchestra is doing at any given moment, but they are influencing the overall direction in a way that gets that whole group to harmonize. And so that's really an important part of the product management role. And for companies that want to foster a facilitation type of role for product, they need to be really clear about the fact that that's the expectation for the PM, and to hold the PM accountable for being a successful facilitator rather than being directly accountable for business outcomes, which is a hard thing to hold people to, because when a company is not hitting its business outcomes, it often looks for one person to hold accountable. But Facebook, for example, does a really nice job with this. Apple does a really nice job with this. And so when you have that conductor role, then one of the skills of the product owner is to be able to draw upon all of the various perspectives of the folks on the team: design, data science, user research, product engineering, pull those perspectives together and create a conversation that gets that group of stakeholders to a point where they feel like they have that informed conviction to make a decision going forward. And if they don't feel like as a group that they can get there, then they have a clear plan for what they need to do next in order to get there.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Last question from Whitney. Can we hear more about Outpace? What's exciting you the most about this venture?
Yeah. So I started Outpace about 18 months ago. I have, throughout my career, found coaching to be incredibly valuable. There's nothing quite like having someone that you can talk to who's dedicated to listening to you, who is able to help you ask the right questions, is able to draw from your experience and their experience to help you think through a really challenging problem. And one of the reasons I think coaching is so valuable is because every single professional relationship is pressurized in some way, right? Even if you have the best manager in the world, they're still your manager, they're still evaluating you, and there may be things that you're comfortable with or not comfortable with talking with them about. Same with stakeholders, same with even mentors and peers. All of those relationships have a give and take in some way, but your relationship with your coach is something that's entirely there for you, and your coach is there for you. And so it's unpressurized and incredibly powerful as a result. And it's one of the reasons that there's something like a 95% satisfaction rate with people that have worked with a coach. The problem is that coaching has been inaccessible. It's hard to find a good coach. It's hard to afford a good coach. And so I've been thinking about that problem for years, and always had the question of, is this just a services business and it's just hard to scale, or is it possible in a very consumer product oriented way to rethink coaching and make it much more accessible for folks? And I got inspired by seeing what is happening with companies like Calm and Headspace and Talkspace and Noom, some of the interesting companies around healthcare like Roman and Hims. There's a whole bunch of interesting companies that are rethinking the relationship between a person and a provider through the lens of really good consumer product. And so we've started to build out a really productized experience that enables people to access coaching in a way that's much more affordable than in the past. Our first program is called Leveling Up as a Product Leader. We've built what we think is the most comprehensive coaching program ever designed for product folks. We're working with great product coaches who have experience in the past. And so that's our live coaching offering. And right now we're in the process of building out a completely AI enabled coaching offering. So, even for people that, even the fact that we've decreased the cost of coaching means that, it's a lot cheaper, but it's still pretty expensive to have someone who's meeting with you on a regular basis who has the expertise that people often need. And so our AI coaching program is taking that and creating a much more scalable version of it. So it's going to be the first one-on-one coaching product available for $50 a month, much more accessible, that is working incredibly well. Like the advances in generative AI have been great, especially when you're able to fine tune what those models are trying to accomplish for folks. So ultimately our mission, like starting from that, bringing it back to the product strategy stack, is to enable everyone to benefit from the superpower of one-on-one coaching. And that's something that we're doing both through making live coaching more accessible and effective, as well as offering AI-driven coaching.
Awesome. Fantastic.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Thank you, Whitney. We have come to the end of our session. Sadly, I'm sure we could continue for another hour, but Ravi has a startup to build. Ravi, thank you very much for making time to speak to the community. It's been absolutely fantastic. Lots of insights and learnings. I'm sure everyone would agree. I think when you and the family travel to South Africa, it'd be great to
that sounds great.
Meet in person and set up something for the community. I think that'd be fantastic. But thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you everyone else as well for attending at the end of your long days. And yeah, that's it for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to meet all of you.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Cheers,
Ravi.
everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye,
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.